These Small Hours with Russell Cordell Staker. There you are, my friends, and here am I. This is These Small Hours podcast, and I am Russell Cordell Staker. It is the evening of April 16, 2021, and I am broadcasting out from Austin, Texas, out to wherever you may be. And I want you to know it's nice to have you along, so thank you for listening. Tonight, I'm going to formally introduce a new and what I would describe as an ongoing element into the elixir of These Small Hours podcast. This is going to be what I would describe as an oratorical essay. And I'll give you the title of that, and we'll get right into it here in just a moment. But let me just give you a little bit of structure around what I was considering as I was preparing this, the 11th production of the podcast, and what I think is going to be a really interesting aspect of what I'm producing and putting out into the universe. I would describe this as my Shakespearean Shangri-La beneath the summer moon. I'm kind of borrowing from a lyric in the song Kashmir by Led Zeppelin there a little bit. But this is a remote, idyllic little hideaway in this particular avenue of what I'm going to do with the podcast. A beautiful place, both real and imagined, where I'm going to share insights around my more comprehensive reading as I'm going back through Shakespeare. And I'll give some more texture around that, but I'm rereading the entire comprehensive works of the great bard right now, and I intend to utilize many, if not all, of his plays as human considerations of thought and language for this writer, Russell Staker, and possibly intend to write a full book when I get through this. I'm reading a lot of different things right now, and so it's going to take some time. But what I'm working on as I'm going back through, some of the offshoot of that thinking is going to show up on this podcast as a journey itself, somewhere along the line of some deeper considerations that I have, as I'd mentioned, for something that I'm probably going to do a bigger project on, which will not show itself on the podcast. So therefore, tonight's production is the first of this kind of series, and I'm going to be intermingling and sprinkling in various aspects as you see this podcast continue to evolve. And I do hope that if you keep coming back, that there will be an element of surprise with this that will be both edifying but at the same time interesting, because I'm obviously pushing myself as a writer and I'm developing my craft. I consider myself first and foremost a novelist, even though I still am working on that first book, and it's coming. I have many plans to write other books, but in the process of doing that, I have to also develop the craft, and that's why I am a big believer that sometimes in order to go where you want to go, you kind of have to give some of this away, and that's what these elements within the podcast are and why it is I'm pursuing what I'm doing right now. I assure you that this will not be some lecture on Shakespeare. I'm not trying to be a professor. You are not my student. As I would describe this oratorical essay and this, my Shakespearean Shangri-La beneath the summer moon, as I'm kind of like subtitling this thing, it's as though it's like the lyric from the song from one of my favorite bands from Glasgow, the Simple Minds. They sing in the song Alive and Kicking. It'd be like the sweetest cup I share with you. And that's what we're going to really get into. So with that said, the 11th production tonight, I've titled Whate'er the Course, the End is the Renown, the title of which I have taken directly from a line from the gentlewoman in William Shakespeare's play, All's Well That Ends Well, Helena. And I think when I read that line as I was going through that play, which I'm going to be introducing tonight in this podcast, it really centered around a grand panoply of thought that I had, which I'm going to give forth. And I think hopefully at the end of this, you'll see why this title stuck out and why it made sense for this particular oratorical essay. I want to begin tonight by talking about or bringing up a very interesting interview that took place in 1997 on HBO. The comedian Jon Stewart emceed or interviewed the great George Carlin, who both of these gentlemen I revere very greatly. George Carlin particularly is one of my heroes, not only as a comedian, but just as a speaker. And he was a very, very in-depth human who had a gift with language. And it was something that early on, even before I understood a lot of his humor as a younger guy coming up and then paying more attention to it, I noted the language and why it was so important to him because of the way he would convey his humor. And what was really striking about this interview, which I saw when it came out back in 1997, and I recently went back to it because I'd remembered that the interview was a really good one, was Jon Stewart starts the interview by asking George Carlin about the language. And if I were in Jon Stewart's shoes, I would have done the same thing. So I'm going to paraphrase some of just the very beginning of that particular interview. And if you get a chance, this is really one to watch. Go onto YouTube and you can type in Jon Stewart interviews George Carlin or whatever, and really watch the whole interview because it's fascinating and so insightful. So I'm going to start there. The salt and pepper haired Jon Stewart that we know today was not the case in 97. He had a beautiful brunette sheen of hair, and he wore this really nice looking leather coat. And I remember it had a beige turtleneck. Well, and of course I've seen this on YouTube to reconfirm it, but I just remember he looked pretty cool. And George Carlin had his standard wear, which was a black, a nice black shirt, like a crew cut, nice shirt with a charcoal colored suit coat. And they're sitting at this, across from a little table from each other. And what I sensed in just watching, and I remember at the very beginning of the interview, just the look of wonder and delight that Jon Stewart had on his face as he was sitting across from one of his comedic heroes, and certainly one of mine, but I'm not Jon Stewart and I'm not a comedian. Or, maybe someday I might try some of that. But the bottom line is that I just sensed this great interest. And obviously Jon Stewart had a great opportunity to interview a master of comedy. He begins the interview by asking, and I'm going to paraphrase some of this, and I'm only drawing on maybe the first 5 minutes at all from that interview, because this really stood out for me and where I'm going with this oratorical essay of tonight. But he asks George Carlin, he says, when you were a kid, you wanted to be Danny Kaye and Bob Hope. How is this thing so far working out for you? And George Carlin gets this big smile on his face. And his reply was, well, I knew I wanted to be silly and have people say, isn't he cute and clever? And as a kid, it was a psychic reward to get the attention of adults and approval and a little bit of respect. And you keep going back for it. But in my toolkit, my genetic toolkit, I was given included a mother and a father who were very funny people. They were the kind of people who could do accents and dialects and tell funny stories about what happened on the bus that morning and have a punchline. And he put a lot of emphasis on that, which I thought was interesting. So you don't lick it off the rocks, as they say in Ireland, and the crowd laughs. And he says, so I thank my grandmother's milkman, actually, and he smiles. But then there's this seriousness that comes back in his face, and he remarks, you never know where these things come from. And Jon Stewart, in thinking that over, he replies back, he says, over the years, I've noticed your fascination with language. It's very apparent. Watching you work is almost like watching a musician, the way you weave words, which is an interjection. When I heard Jon Stewart say this and he makes this comment, I thought back on the play that I just got done rereading, All's Well That Ends Well. And one of the lords in the play is speaking, and I won't give all the context here, but he says, and I quote, in the web of our life, the web of our life is of a mingled yarn, good and ill together. And so this weaving of words that Jon Stewart was alluding to with George Carlin, that really came right up to the surface. And Jon Stewart continues, he says, you use language for emphasis and all that. Was that always a fascination for you, even as a kid? George Carlin says, well, to go backwards with the question, don't forget what we do is oratory. It's rhetoric. It's not just comedy. It's a form of rhetoric. And with rhetoric, you look and listen for rhythms. You look for ways to sing at the same time you're talking. Da-da-da-da-da-doom, da-doon-da-doon-da-doom, da-da-da-doon, doon-doon-doon-doon, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. And so he kind of goes through this thing of cadence and rhyme and this sound. And then he says, and it's just a natural part of how we speak. And this is the part that I want to zero in on here. George Carlin sits back a little and he says, my grandfather, whom I never knew, was a policeman in New York at the turn of the century. And he was an uneducated man, self-educated. And he, in the course of his adult life, wrote out the works of Shakespeare by hand because of the joy it gave him. Here, George Carlin pauses and breathes in with visible emotion, and there's a liquid wetness in his eyes, and it went right to my heart because I too have done the same thing. I haven't written out the entire works, but throughout the course of my life, as I've read Shakespeare, I've often written down passages purely for the joy of the words, and to see in George Carlin's face what that meant to him as a comedian who's had this great career, to hearken back and think of a grandfather that he did not know in this life. But what he knew about his grandfather was this love of language, this passion. And again, I'm going to use the title of this oratorical essay here, Whate'er the Course, the End is the Renown. And to sum up his grandfather in the sense of a story that he had most likely been told and knew and obviously had admired and seen in his own parents and their humor. Language had played a huge part in his life, and it was a reason for George Carlin going on to be who he was. But the story of his grandfather and Shakespeare, it really brought together this idea that I've always felt very strongly about, which is that language matters, and it matters in the course of our lives. It's, I think, the heartbeat of the experience that we go through. It is the oil in our engines, the electricity that lights our inner chambers, the thunder in our hearts. And though we do not know the full measure of our lives, nor the detailed course or the unique road that we will lead or follow, I guess, the language we learn and hopefully acquire will color and define the experience. And in that sense, whate'er the course, the end is the renown. And possibly language alone in the definition of our experience matches the title of Shakespeare's play, which leads me to All's Well That Ends Well. The decision to start with this play, when I was first thinking about, I got this idea, I was working on my novel, and I have another essay that I'm working on, and I've been doing a lot of reading like I always do, and all of a sudden I had this little idea just like pop, and I've about a month ago, I started back reading Shakespeare, and rather than doing it cover to cover, I've done all this background reading of Shakespeare. I thought, well, I'm gonna start with plays that maybe I'm not as familiar with, and then I'll start to get back to the ones that I've read many times over. And so the decision for All's Well That Ends Well was quite frankly because I just really didn't know much about it. If I read it in college, it was only because it was probably part of an assignment. But I, at an earlier age, which I'll get to in just a moment, on my own was reading Shakespeare. So I want to, let me just give you a little description about my particular book, My Complete Works of Shakespeare. And for those of you out there that may or may not have a copy of the complete works, maybe you never had one. Some of you probably do. And some of you, if you studied literature or philosophy or, political science, even economics, it can happen. You'll have a class in the arts and humanities where you might be required to go out and buy the complete works. For those of you that hung on to your book, I commend you, first of all, because you're part of a rare class. Secondly, this is an opportunity to get it back out because Shakespeare is worth the effort. And as George Carlin described with his grandfather and so many others that have come to Shakespeare, there is something about the words. It's beyond the stories, it's beyond the plays, but the only way you can get to that is through the discipline of the language. But this isn't like going to hard discipline school. The joys that come very quickly with Shakespeare, and especially as you've gotten some dirt under your fingernails and you get a little older in life, it becomes life-giving. So let me describe my particular book, which I've held on to since 1986. I acquired it from my mother. I got it from her bookshelf. She didn't give it to me. I took it. I took it in 1986 when we lived in Englewood, Colorado. And it was on one of the bookshelves just around the main corner of the front living room where I grew up. And it's titled Shakespeare, The Complete Works. It's edited by G.B. Harrison. The publisher is Harcourt, Brace and World Incorporated, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Atlanta, 1948. Was the print edition that I have. It's a bullet grain blue, worn and frayed, weighty, cumbersome hardcover with that lovely, musky, mildewed scent of the years. The book, my mother used it. She had it in college, she told me, but to be frankly honest, because it was published in 1948, I'm not sure that she bought it at school. She attended Brigham Young University like I did before I was born, up until the time that I was born. And I'm not sure if she bought it there. My hunch is that she got it from the shelves of her mother and father and in Pleasant Grove, Utah. And I've mentioned in previous podcasts, my grandmother, we called her Grammy, she was a master teacher. She had a master's in education, very, very well read, very well traveled woman. Her husband, my grandfather, was a former university president of Southern Utah University. His father was one of the founding fathers of the university in Cedar City, Utah. Both my grandfather and my great-grandfather were full professors, PhDs from New York University, one in history, the other in English. And they both taught history and English interchangeably. As a side note, my grandfather was very instrumental in Cedar City's growth into its own Shakespearean festival. He doesn't get credit for starting that, but he was a professor of literature and was known for his passion for Shakespeare in Cedar City. And there were many students after he died very young and untimely, that reminisced about the fact that Dr. Driggs, my grandfather, was instrumental in getting them to read Shakespeare. So anyway, my hunch is that book, I'm hoping, most likely came from them, but I can't say. It sure is old, and it's got all the history built into it, which just makes it that much better. But on top of that, I've built in my own history, because since 1986, when I was 12, and I started reading it on my own, it has its own wear that I'm familiar with because of the years that I've carried it with me. I began reading it, as I'd mentioned, in earnest at 12. Much of it I could not understand, but it didn't matter. I was trying on language for size. I was feeling its weight, its lift, hearing its sound, tasting its pleasure, if you will. I was undressing it, as it were. A beautiful woman, and I don't mean that in a sexist way. I mean that as a romantic, a person that I would have been very attracted to, and I wanted to know and deeply love. And so for me, Shakespeare was sensual. It was more than just, run-of-the-mill words. There was something about the cadence and the rhythm and the rhyme that, even though I did not understand at the age of 12 and 13 and 14, by the time I got into 15, 16, things started to make a little more sense because I persisted with it. I just sensed that the words were touching on the things in life that we want to spend the most time doing and learning about and being surrounded by. But life has this very beautiful way of obstructing the very passions that we're after in life. And I don't mean this sensuality as sex per se. It's a lot of, it can be that. It's the understanding of experience and the way we feel and all of the spectral, as I call it, the spectral thrust of the human experience. And in the words, what I sensed was that Shakespeare had a full palette. He was painting with a brush that could mix every aspect of life, and he could do it freely. He could interchange ideas and logic and thought and passions and burning hatreds and pains and joys and sadnesses and happinesses in such a way that when he painted onto the canvas of the plays that he wrote, I wasn't just reading the words, I was feeling them, and I was trying the words on for size. In reading Shakespeare then and now and always, I have had an odd thought. And this is going to be a little difficult because I'm going to try to put this in the best words that I can. Because it's not a graspable thought, but it's there. And it's come back over the years. I recognized it when I was a young boy. I've felt it when I was at college. I was studying English literature, and then I was really deeply studying Shakespeare as a wannabe scholar. I wasn't, going to go on and be this scholarly whatever. But anyway, and then as I've gone on in my life and I've persisted reading Shakespeare, I've had this thought. It keeps coming back. And so I'm going to try my best to describe this. I'm thinking of condensed time, how condensed time from antiquity to now, maybe even before antiquity, long before time was even measured, really is, and in considering it, I have, or once I did anyway, a fear with this idea of condensed time, almost like a dis-ease or a discomfort, a shock of what it would mean to be suddenly reunited with the people across the full spectrum of mortality that I never knew in this life. Human beings that Shakespeare writes about, Shakespeare himself. And again, Shakespeare lived in the 16th century, 16th, 17th century. So he's really not that far back. But, for a kid of 12, that's thousands of years before, so it felt. But anyway, in considering this idea of being reunited with those that I've never known, that lived long before I did, and all the long hallways of my own foremothers and fathers, and also all the vast many lives who will follow and lead on through mortality long after I'm dead and gone, and I'm removed from my own existence, most likely going to be forgotten, and that's fine. That whatever memory there would be of me also is faded to the point where, I'm just part of the mass of those that have come before and lived and gone. Much like Shakespeare now, if you think about it. There's this heavy, unconcluded or undecided thought, more like a whispering and a wondering, that comes up. It's quite natural and it's real for me. And again, it's hard to describe, and I'm struggling even now. I wrote a couple of trigger words that I'm looking on a piece of paper right now. And even now, I still can't quite get there. I think what I'm striving to say more than anything is that there is this sense when we live our lives, and, again, I'm going to use the title here that, whatever the course, the end is the renown. The course of our lives become so centered on ourself and on our time, on our experience, that it precludes anything that came before. It substantiates anything that might come after, to the point where we center ourselves as the beginning, the middle, and the end. And everything else is like a bright shock of, I'm not sure I want to be a part of this bigger thing, which is a weird thing to say because we do. And ultimately, we are going to be thrown or thrust back into that broad sea or ocean of humanity that came before and certainly will come after. And reading Shakespeare is a link that seems to pull in the whole thing. And what I felt as a dis-ease or a discomfort in that shock of thinking as a kid, I'm not as shocked by it now, but the thought still comes up. And what I realize as I'm getting older is that my sense of self, the identity of my own time, is diminished in a healthy way. And what I see now is that I and my experience in my life really ultimately are meant to be enfolded into this very vast history of humanity. And the one thing that connects us is the language of our lives. And that in the end, if we ourselves are just a word in and of itself doesn't really belong alone. It's part of a bigger sentence. It's part of a bigger paragraph. It's part of a bigger chapter. It's part of a bigger book, maybe an epic, and on and on and on. And so reading Shakespeare for me, more than any other book, it brings that kind of thinking forward. And I've had that for a long time. I must have known early on about this link as I was reading Shakespeare, that I was meant to join myself to and be ready to be linked forward with this greater sense of humanity. And I think that early on, that in addition to what I described earlier as the sensuality of the language, was one of the huge pulls for why I stayed interested in reading it. I don't know where the interest came that told me in my own heart of hearts, hey, I want to read Shakespeare. Granted, I have some DNA because of my own family and history that I'm sure a lot of that has to do with it. But nobody ever came to me and said, hey, Russell, you really need to read Shakespeare. Certainly not when I was 12. But I had a sense about that very early on that was a compulsion. And so when I picked it up, what I found was a challenge, and I was accepting that challenge, even though I knew I was not going to understand this. I might as well have been reading German for all I knew. But in sounding out those words and in coursing through those pages and persisting in the stories that I would glean little elements from, I became more centered in this thing that I just got done describing, which I'm still trying to figure out. And so to the play at hand, William Shakespeare's All's Well That Ends Well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this up very quickly. Like I said, I'm not your professor. This is not a class on Shakespeare. But I want to give you a taste from the sweetest cup that I'm holding in my hand right now. And I want you to taste this elixir. And I want you to feel what I'm feeling, if you can. Or if I'm able, what is really what I should say, if I'm able to convey this in a way so that you can. This isn't on you, this is on me, and I hope I can deliver. And if you're willing to give me just a little bit more of your time and lend an ear and your heart with this and really open up to where I'm going to go, then I think we're going to connect tonight, and we're going to connect at a very deep level. And as I proceed forth every now and then with a little foray into my Shangri-La, my Shakespearean Shangri-La, then I hope that this will be an idyllic setting, a place that you can come to and say, uh-oh, Staker's going there again. I really liked what he did with All's Well That Ends Well. Let's venture forward with this next one. That's my hope, okay? So let me give you some backstory about the play. Whate'er the course, the end is the renown, and we're going to walk down that. But first, we start with the backstory to this play, which was very interesting as I did some deeper reading on it after I went back and I read it. Which, like I said earlier, I'm not sure I ever read this play from start to finish the way I just did this past week. And I'm glad that I've read it when I did, because this play meant a lot to me now. I'm not sure I would have followed with it as much earlier. In 1566, a man of Kent in southeast England who held the post of clerk, or clerk as they say in English, of the Ordnance of the Tower of London in the Public Record Office, published a book of translations entitled The Palace of Pleasure. It was inclusive of some 60 tales, and the inscription on the cover of the book, which I pulled up on Google, and it's really cool because I don't know if it was in the Gutenberg Library, and I'm probably saying it wrong, but the library in London that actually houses one of the original first print editions of this, took pictures of it, and it's really cool to see these really old books. And again, published in 1566, but the inscription at the very front, it says Elizabethan versions of Italian and French novels from Boccaccio is how the English would say, but it's Boccaccio in Italian, if you're going to say it, Boccaccio. Bandello, Cinthio, Straparola, and Queen Margaret of Navarre, and others, done into English by William Painter. William Painter was just a run-of-the-mill clerk, but he had a gift for translation. Obviously, he spoke Italian, he spoke French, and he had a passion for language, which ties back to what I was thinking with George Carlin. It ties back to my own sense of whatever the words link us, regardless of the geographic boundaries and certainly the time boundaries of this life and the one that preceded this life, the one that is to come. That things that are written and written well stay written, and they carry forward, and they trigger others to do the same in their own form. I'm grateful to William Painter for being a translator, because he translated this Palace of Pleasure, which William Shakespeare later in life came to. I'm going to get to that. So Painter's first volume of said book, The Palace of Pleasure, was a sensation. The following year, he would publish a second volume in 1567 with an additional 34 tales. These volumes would mean a great deal, as I mentioned, to William Shakespeare when he had grown a foot or two. So this was published, like I said, 1566, 1567. Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in Warwickshire, England. Warwickshire, I guess is how you'd say it, or Warwickshire, in 1564, and would die there in 1616, where he rests to this day at the Church of the Holy Trinity. In thinking of George Carlin here, I got back to and thinking of William Painter. So, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So William Painter writes this book. It's a big sensation. The people of England wanted to read these stories of Italian and French origin that were they were about life and the language that was used. And William Painter was able to put them in English so they could obviously read them. And it carries forward as Shakespeare comes up and he's old enough to start reading. This was one of the first books that he was known to have possessed and read. And the language of writers, as I've been considering here, is continually passed on to and influences the writers who come along. William Painter as a translator, William Shakespeare later on are as the poet and the playwright are no different in the sense that they have played a similar role to me. Now, I'm not a William Shakespeare, but George Carlin, let's pull him in. He's obviously somebody of great renown, and he had a remarkable career that influenced countless people that have laughed at his jokes. But they laughed not because he said things that were funny, but he did that in a way that was artful with the language, with the cadence. All of this goes on and on and on. And we could think of innumerable examples of how language passed on has impact. But I'm grateful because William Shakespeare became who William Shakespeare was, and we have the benefit of his work as a result of the works that were done before that. So within this volume of The Palace of Pleasure was a particular story written by Giovanni Boccaccio, is how you'd pronounce it in Italian. When you look at the spelling, it looks like Giovanni Boccaccio, but in Italian, it's Giovanni Boccaccio. And that work was entitled The Decameron. Before I give the details of the Decameron and why this plays a part in Shakespeare's life, and certainly in the part of why I'm doing this oratorical essay tonight, what it means to me personally, let me just explain Giovanni Boccaccio a little bit. He was an Italian writer, he was a poet, and he was a humanist in Florence. He lived from 1313 to 1375, so we're getting back now. He was considered one of what's called the three crowns of Italian literature. The other two would be Dante and Petrarch. And he was a towering literary figure of Europa in the 14th century. So, if we put this in the parlance of even Shakespeare, he would have been like the Shakespeare of his time. And we carry it forward. You can pick any great writer, Charles Dickens, certainly in his time, and, we can go forward. But Boccaccio played a huge role in European literature and certainly later in world literature as a result of the work that he was doing. He was by some, and later a great many, considered the greatest European prose writer of his time. This is a quote that I got. I can't remember where I pulled this from, so forgive the gods for me not giving credit here, but it was something off the web. I don't know if it was Wikipedia or I just directly did some reading within some scholarly journal, but the quote that I got here was that he was a versatile writer who amalgamated different literary trends and genres, making them converge in original works thanks to a creative activity exercised under the banner of experimentalism, which is really fascinating to hear that. So, I'm like, wow. Now, by the way, I have not read the Decameron, but you can bet your bottom dollar I'm going to read it. It's going to move up on my reading schedule here. But the Decameron is one of the most notable works of this Palace of Pleasure that William Painter translated from Italian. And the Decameron itself is a collection of short stories or novellas, probably, subtitled The Human Comedy. Boccaccio wrote this between 1348 and 1353 during the Black Death epidemic that was plaguing Florence and much of Europe at the time. Again, irony here because we're going through our own form of plague at this moment. It details 100 tales as told by 7 young women and 3 young men as they shelter in a secluded villa outside Florence city. These various tales of love, they range from erotic to tragic, and the tales are, they're full of wit. As I did some research and I read about this, they've got practical jokes. They are basically life lessons that contribute to this mosaic of prose that Boccaccio put on paper that just had this phenomenal impact, not only in Italy, but obviously throughout Europe. And even today it is considered, or went on obviously, is considered a masterpiece of classical early Italian prose. So Boccaccio was heavily influenced, and this is a link now to English. So in thinking about the translations and what this meant, long before William Painter came along, and in the same time frame, so about the 14th century here, Boccaccio had a heavy influence on Geoffrey Chaucer. of London, England, who wrote the Canterbury Tales. Now, that is a work that I'm very familiar with. I've read twice, and I've also dipped into at various points when I was a student at Brigham Young studying literature. I studied it again, and it wasn't for a particular class, but I remember I read it for some research and I did some writing on it. But the Canterbury Tales, if you're not familiar with that, are basically short stories, tales as well, that are very much in the guise of what Decameron or the Decameron was all about. And Geoffrey Chaucer was writing that from 1387 all the way until his death in 1400. And it's one of the first major literary works in the English language. Now, stick with me. This may feel a little bit dry, but we're going to pull this together here. The reason why we're going here is that the passover of language from these great writers of earlier days to English and then the carry forward has a trend in the human aspect that we're reaching for and what we experience. The Decameron is the source of inspiration that William Shakespeare derived and therefore wrote the play that I'm going to talk briefly about tonight, which is All's Well That Ends Well. And Shakespeare, and I've often heard, I remember U2, Bono singing that every poet is a thief. There's a lot of truth to that. I think musicians are the same way, painters are the same way. When they get a great idea, they borrow certain things that they see and then they add to them, or, obviously they have to create their own works. We're not talking about plagiarizing here, we're talking about borrowing ideas. And Shakespeare certainly was very influenced by William Paynter's translation of Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron. And he followed Boccaccio's story in the main quite closely in the play that comes out as All's Well That Ends Well. But he created something that was wholly original and artistic of his own in the play. And what he produced, in addition to the characters that he developed, is remarkably entertaining and also quite edifying in the language and the power that it conveys. Shakespeare wrote the play somewhere between 1601 and 1604, and it was later printed fully in the first folio, or folio 1, F1, as they call it. And in my edition of the complete works of Shakespeare, G.B. Harrison, the way you would notate that would be F1, F2, whatever for the folio. So in that first folio, it was included. But what's interesting about All's Well That Ends Well was it was a play that not only showed the maturity of Shakespeare's writing, because it was most likely written, or based on the years that I'm looking at, in the latter half of his career, but it was not very popular, and it's rarely spoken of in contemporary mentions. So in the scholarly journals of the time, and then certainly as we proceed forward into history, there's not a lot of mention of it. So it was rarely spoken of, much less acted. And that's specifically in his time. In modern era, because of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre and certainly the individuals like me in the world, there's a great resurgence for Shakespeare, and we look at Shakespeare holistically today. But back in his day, he would have been like it's a bad example. I don't follow a lot of Broadway, so forgive me. But like a great director of film, like a Steven Spielberg, let's say, some people are going to go boo to that. He's not like this big artist. No, Steven Spielberg is great. I love him. So, but what I'm saying is that, Steven Spielberg has, his out of the park blockbuster great movies that we go back to. And then there are some that, just don't do very well. For Shakespeare, this would have been one that was not very well uptaken. And so as a result, it's not really spoken of. So, it's lumped into, I'm going to get ahead of myself here. So hang on a second. Like his play Measure for Measure, it employs what's called the bed trick. And this is something, it was like a mechanism or a ploy that Shakespeare uses to add a little bit of acceleration to a story and also make it interesting, but there's a little bit of drama with it. But basically what it is whereby a reluctant husband is cheated into giving his wife her due rights. And what's interesting about that, when I think about that idea, and I'm taking this from G.B. Harrison because he describes this bed trick, it makes me wonder, as an aside, are these really the rights that a husband has to dictate the terms for his wife and vice versa? There's this eternal interplay of man and woman and societal misinterpretations of each. And what I like about what Shakespeare did, even in his time, even though this was not a very well-renowned play, is that he was never afraid to go there. And in a lot of ways, Shakespeare does that because he's interested in getting a reaction. And he goes to the center of the universe for him, which is how the dialogue works and how the language interplays with the characters that he creates and sets up. And so even though we may have to suspend our beliefs, sometimes we may be offended as we read Shakespeare, like, oh, how could that even be possible? We also have to remember that in our particular day and time, we're not in Elizabethan England. And at the same time, Shakespeare wasn't too concerned about the long-term aspect of how somebody might misread it, because he knew that in the heart of the humanness of the stories that he was telling in the language, that the interpretation would be everlasting and it would be immortal. And that's why we're still reading Shakespeare to this day. So I'll give a little more structure to this in a moment, but what I want to do now is very briefly give a synopsis of the play before I share some of the language that we're leading to. And I think it'll give some nice insight here. In essence, All's Well That Ends Well is a play that is neither a comedy nor a tragedy, though it is too easily lumped into the comedy swim lane. And with my copy of the complete works, it's listed as a comedy, or at least within the subtext, the foreword before the play. But as I read it, I'm not sure I would really call it that. This, to me, was a very true form experience of life, not the story in the mechanism, which I'm going to describe here, but in the really subtle heartbeat. In my previous podcast, I wrote an essay about nuance. There's a really fine form of nuance right dead center in this play, and particularly with the one character that just sings off the page, and that's the gentlewoman Helena. That to me is really, it's resoundingly powerful and very real. She was real to me. The others, they kind of like, it was like they were props in some ways, but I don't want to diminish either what Shakespeare was doing with some of the others. We'll get to that. So it is, as I and G.B. Harrison suggest slightly, kind of in between, but I'm not going to call it a comedy, and it's neither a tragedy, even though it has elements of both, but that's how life is. G.B. Harrison called it an interlude, and I think that's the word that I would use. I like that, borrowing that from him. It was a play that Shakespeare wrote as a window into the silliness and possibly the mess of life without it requiring too much hand-wringing, and that seemed to come forward. And those are my words, by the way. His word was interlude, but I'm coloring with how I sensed it as I finished reading it. As I was reading it, I had that feeling, and certainly as I got to the end. It does offer some profoundly great theater on the page. And above all else, as always, and this goes back to when I first started reading Shakespeare, it didn't matter to me really what the story was. I mean, it does now. But at the time, it was just about the joy of reading the words and the magic in the language. And Helena, as the gentlewoman of Roussillon in southwestern France, she's marvelous. And I think I felt... I probably put her up on a pedestal as I read the play, because I read into her far more deeply than even a lot of the critical and scholarly analysis. They tend to diminish maybe how they see her. I saw her very, very in a grander scale than even what Shakespeare probably intended. So here's the story. Let me walk you through this, and I'll do this as quickly as I can. And then I'm going to do some brief readings of certain parts of this that I think it's like I said, it's the simple minds, the sweetest cup that I'm going to share with you. And I want you to taste this, and I want you to experience it. But in order for you to feel what I felt and what I feel when I read this, I need to give you a little bit of backdrop. Obviously, I would love for you to go read this play, and you can do it, in a day or two if you really pay attention. But that's why I'm going to walk you through some of this right now. So in short, this is the entire story. The King of France, or France, who has employed the son of his former attendant in Paris, who this son's name, or he's called the Count, is Bertram. And he's now the new attendant to the King of France, who is suffering from a fistula, which is just an abscess. That's the word that Shakespeare uses, fistula, which that's a medical term. The daughter of a recently deceased famous physician, Helena, this gentlewoman, of which I've alluded to now a few times, she is infatuated with the Count of Roussillon, Bertram. She's just madly in love with him, and he's terribly handsome. And I'm going to use some of my own words, but this is kind of how I envisioned, based on her view of him. But she also recognizes that he's terribly flawed. But it doesn't matter. As we all know, love has a way of glossing over certain things when we go head over heels for somebody. It doesn't matter what sex you are or whatever. Whatever your passion is for that other person, it kind of glosses over some of those cracks that are all too evident, and nobody's perfect. But anyway, she, being the daughter of this recently deceased physician, is also a healer and recognizes that the King of France is suffering from this abscess, from this fistula. And she sees an opportunity because the Count of Roussillon, Bertram, has been called up from Roussillon, which is in southeastern France, if I remember correctly, to go to Paris to work for the king. And she sees an opportunity to win this nobleman's heart by first healing the King of France, who is his boss, so to speak. And so she goes to Paris to present to the king, hey, I know you're suffering and you're ill. I'm a healer. And though Shakespeare offers no great explanation as to what exactly she's going to do, she's confident in her ability, and the king is to be expected. He's skeptical, and he's not sure that she can really help him, even though she is the daughter of the physician that would have treated him, but who is now deceased. And she makes a deal with him to encourage the trust that he's a little bit waning in giving to her, where she says, I will guarantee a cure by ensuring that this fistula is taken care of and you will feel better. And if I'm not, then you can put me to death. Very Shakespearean, by the way. So matter of fact, I don't think in today's world we'd certainly do it with the amount of selfishness we see in the world. But this woman was willing to put her cards where they were. She said, you can put me to death should I fail. Or if she succeeds, which she's confident that she will be, then she can have her pick of a husband from the king of France's court. And so the king accepts the wager. And why wouldn't he? I mean, he's obviously suffering. And I'm going to add some color here. Lady Helena, or the gentlewoman Helena, she's a very fair young woman, certainly articulate. She's got a lot of poise and presence. She's persistent in her manner, and she's confident. And so the king has nothing to lose. And quite frankly, this is a very good scenario. Well, she heals him, and he rises from his sick bed and is made whole again. And so she very dutifully comes forward, and she picks Bertram to be her lawfully wedded husband. Well, Count Bertram, now we're going to shift gears for just a moment, is, I'm going to use some kind of direct language, is kind of a horse's ass. I didn't like Bertram at all. And I tried to be, in various points in the play, I tried to find some redeeming qualities. What's interesting is in the scholarly texts and some of the side things that I was reading, a lot of other individuals felt similar. And there have been some plays done in recent years where they've tried to elevate Bertram. Sometimes they diminish him. And it's really in how the text is read. And I understand from an artistic perspective in acting, he certainly has some redeemable qualities. But to me, I didn't give him much quarter. I just felt like he was just a pig the entire time. And with Helena, let me just quickly say this. With Helena, she's also diminished in a lot of the scholarly journals. They try to diminish her because of the bed trick that she pulls and the deceitful nature of, as it is described, as what she does to try to win his love. And we're going to get to that in a second. But I didn't see that. I actually saw something far deeper in what her motion is, and it's based on the language that we're going to get to. Anyway, Count Bertram wants none of it. And he decides he's going to get the hell gone to the Italian wars. He's going to Florence to go fight for the King of France. But the big reason is he just wants to get out of there. And in the play, he says, I wed her, but will not bed her. So Bertram's mother, who's the countess to the king, and she immediately is drawn to Helena and actually takes Helena under her wing. And the old Lord LeFou, which I kind of picked up, and maybe I misread this, but I think that is... I think that's Bertram's, I don't know, he must be the attendant to Bertram's former father, because he kind of steps into that role as almost a father figure. He wasn't his father because Bertram, as I'd mentioned, lost his father. But both LeFou and the countess, the mother of Bertram, they're appalled at Bertram's behavior. And so they take Helen in as one of their own while he leaves town. And they wish that Bertram had not taken this rash act to just, get out in this self-inflicted exile because he doesn't want to bed this woman. So Bertram goes to war, and basically, and this is kind of a bad way to say it, but he also goes on kind of a royal ass hunt as well, and seduces a woman, a virgin out there by the name of Diana, who's a local virgin in Florence. And prior to his consummation of his wooing, Helena, and I'm kind of moving this forward, Helena is so distraught that Bertram is left that she decides, you know what, this isn't worth it. I didn't want to ruin his life. Obviously, he doesn't want to be married to me. I'm going to let this go. And Bertram even gives her a challenge. He says to her, look, the only way I'm going to be truly wedded to thee is if I give one of the rings on my fingers onto your finger, and you are bearing one of bearing a child that I've procreated with you, then I will call you wife. So in a way, he kind of presents that as a challenge, but it's an impossible challenge because then he leaves to go fight this war in Italy. So when he leaves, Helen is distraught. She basically declares, I'm going to let this go. She leaves the court and basically goes to look for him in Italy because she has another design, which I'm going to get at this bed trick to try to win his love. But she also fakes her own death so that it will look as if she's going to be somebody else. And she becomes this pilgrim that goes into the area, and she meets up with this very same woman who Bertram is wooing and wants to bed. Her name's Diana, and Diana's living with her mother, a widow. And Helena comes forth and says, look, I'm actually who I am, and this guy is trying to get in bed with you. And what I'd really like to do is I still have an opportunity to win his love, but in order to do that, I need your help here. Well, Diana is of reason here, and this was a part of the play that to me didn't make a lot of sense because I kind of sense that Diana's digging Bertram if he's a handsome guy, and he's obviously a nobleman. She's a local country woman who probably, didn't have a lot of opportunity, and this guy's going to bed her and probably going to, wants to marry her. So the fact that all of the sudden Diana shows a great deal of generosity and kindness to Helena in disguise as a pilgrim and goes along with this guise to say, okay, well, I'll let him woo me. And then Diana tells Bertram, come back late one night, after my mom's in bed, so to speak, and you can climb in bed with me. But what Bertram doesn't know when he climbs in bed is that it's not Diana, it's actually Helena, who is disguised as Diana. They end up making love. The ring is exchanged, and Helena ends up bearing a child or becoming pregnant with the child of Bertram. There's a little subplot that's going on to the side of this that I'm not even going to mention with a character by the name of Perros, which from a theatricality standpoint is delightful to read. But for the sake of this production tonight, I'm not even going to mention that. But I bring it up because there's this kind of side thing going on. And now I'm going to fast forward to the very end of the play. Well, Bertram believes that Helena is actually dead. So, whatever rights that, he had to deliver to his former wife, who he didn't want to be married to, he doesn't have to deliver. Those have been forfeited. He's had sex with Diana, who he's got, this hot, passionate love for, and he's impregnated her. And so he goes back to the King of France, all prepared to, to marry this woman rightfully, because now he can do so. But as I've just alluded to and told you directly, this was all a guise. So in fact, Helen is the one that's bearing his child. And on top of that, Diana is going to quit this marriage proposal altogether. And so she breaks the engagement off at the palace in France and comes forward right at the very end of the play, as Shakespeare is wont to do with a lot of his plays. And there's a kind of a schemed ring swap prior to this that led up to this challenge that I talked about. But when she comes to the main court in front of the king, reveals herself in almost a riddle, saying, yes, I'm Diana, but lo and behold, here's Helena. She steps forward, and Bertram's shocked, and immediately in one line, and I don't have that line right in front of me, but he basically says, "Forgive me both." He recognizes what he's done. And this is the part of the play that, it's quite improbable, I think, when anybody reads it, but in Elizabethan times, it would have been accepted wholesale for what it was. But very quickly, he asks for forgiveness. And in realizing that Helena has artfully basically met his challenge. She managed to get the ring on his finger, and she made love to him, and she's pregnant with his child. Then he says, verily, to the point, I will love you from here on after. And they end up getting married, and all's well that ends well. So that's a very short synopsis of basically what the play is about. The story of itself, to me, and now I'm stepping out of, I've just walked you through just the gist of it. There are some other little pieces in there that are actually really exciting to read. But in looking at it, there was nothing really extraordinary. For the most part, it felt overly contrived and a bit problematic given the reality of life. And it's easy as a reader, and certainly we do this now. I can't imagine what it was like to live in Elizabethan times, even though I've done a lot of reading about that. But I think in the high art of what Shakespeare was putting forward, it was so extravagant and so pleasant to watch that I think maybe it probably stunned the realities a little bit, and people were more accepting of that because, even in the sexual mores of the time, there were a lot of things that just weren't discussed. And so I think by the texture of what he writes about and the bed trick and how it just wraps itself up at the very end, people in Elizabethan times weren't thinking about, well, I wonder what that marriage is going to be like 10 years from now. But in today's modern world, and I'm certainly this way, when I read that, I'm like, that marriage is doomed. There is no way that thing's going to work out. To reiterate what I said earlier, Bertram is a pig. The side character of Perrault is a real douche coward. He cheats on Bertram in terms of his loyalty to him. Most of the men, the King of France, with all of his wisdom, is a bit too presumptuous and too entitled and too egocentric and too premature in his pronouncements. The Countess, the mother of Bertram, she's admirable for reading her son the right way based on his behavior, but her role is of little consequence. There's a character called Lavache who's the clown, and he's a clown, so he does a great. I guess he lives up to his role. He is a smartass. But, through all of this, and then there's Diana. So I think if there's another character in the play that was the most dynamic for me, it truly is Diana, because she's dynamic for the fact that she gives up what would be a pretty big opportunity to end up with this Bertram guy, given her place in life, and how she refrains from holding back from actually going to bed with him at the moment that he wanted to, because I probably glossed over that, but he comes hot and heavy for her in this particular scene towards the end of the play. And for all intents and purposes, they were ready to bang the gong, but that didn't happen. She pulls back, and then that's when she plays the guys here, because obviously Helen had gotten to her first. And she said, okay, yeah, we'll get together tonight, but come back after my mom's asleep and then climb through the window or whatever and climb in bed with me. Obviously when it's dark, he's not going to notice. Although again, I guess some guys, it doesn't matter if they're, if their target member is ready to rock, they're not going to pay attention to who they jump in bed with in a situation like this. Although for me, there's no way. I mean, it'd be like, wait a minute, you're not Diana. But anyway, long story short, Diana is a dynamic character because what she does, even though it seems far-fetched, is quite noble. And so, but everybody else, aside from what I just described with Diana, to me, they just almost seem trivial. What sings in the play is Helena. It's her humanity, which outshines the play itself, and in whose language offers a far different and more real woman than what is really portrayed in the plot. And this is where maybe in my own reading, I was employing a sense of my own literary nuance here, because I was thinking of certain aspects of womanhood that are very attractive to me and compelling and generous. And she embodied the best of the best. And I thought of, and this is an interesting thing, I'm not saying this in a way like a literal sense, but as I was reading Helena, and it might just be because I juxtaposed all of this at this particular moment in my reading, I've been listening to a lot of Kate Bush, and the song Running Up That Hill, A Deal with God, which came out in the Hounds of Love album in 1985, which was a record that I bought. I actually bought it in 87. I bought it a couple years after it had come out, but it became a regular staple piece of listening for me. But as I read Helena, I was thinking about Kate Bush, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. I'm just giving you a little introduction here. So I'm going to I now want to pause because with the build up to this, let's get to what this is finally about. And this is the language aspect. And then from there, we're going to pull it all together. In putting myself in the shoes of a Shakespeare, let's say, and thinking about what I described earlier in the influence of things that he'd read, and in the career that obviously he was very focused and very successful at doing at that particular moment when he wrote All's Well That Ends Well. What I think about here is that he started with a mold of clay, a story that in many ways was templated by Boccaccio, influenced by the experience of his own perspective of Elizabethan England, and certainly by the success of the Globe Theatre and what it was that he was able to do and had renown for. And in this particular play, what I see here is a playwright that recognized that he could take a story that had great intrigue. I'm not saying that it didn't, but he made it so much more by the flourish of his language. And I know this has probably been a long lead up to this. And as I go through the Shangri-La going forward, maybe it won't have to be like this, but I wanted to really to stake this claim right here and right now before I share some of this language, because the perspective that I saw as I read this came very, very clearly through, and it made the word sing, as George Carlin described, in the rhythm. It's oratory, it's rhetoric. We're not just speaking, we're also looking for the song and the words, and Shakespeare was gifted in being able to do that. And so much of what I'm going to read in just a few of these snippets before I close this out is from Helena herself, because, again, she sings on the page, and she does so with, as described, bright radiance and collateral light. In Act 1, Scene 1, Helena is speaking of Bertram as he leaves Roussillon for Paris. And this is also at the point where, she's just recently lost her father, the physician, the renowned physician. And so, as I've lost my own father, I imagine the pain that she's probably going through at that particular moment. And yet love has a way of taking away pretty much most pain. It's like it's the highest form of a drug that's really out there in a particular moment. And we see this here. But even then, as intoxicated as she is in this language, what I see is a woman that also has the wherewithal to see things as they are. And it's in the words that Shakespeare gives her. So let me read some of this. Oh, were that all, I think not on my father, and these great tears grace his remembrance more than those I shed for him. What was he like? I have forgot him. My imagination carries no favour in it but Bertram's. I am undone. There is no living, none, if Bertram be away. 'Twere all one that I should love a bright, particular star, and think to wed it. He is so above me. In his bright radiance and collateral light must I be comforted not in his sphere. The ambition in my love thus plagues itself. The hind that would be mated by the lion must die for love. 'Twas pretty, though a plague, to see him every hour to sit and draw his arched brows, his hawking eye, his curls, in our heart's table, heart too capable of every line and trick of his sweet favour. But now he's gone, and my idolatrous fancy must sanctify his relics. One that goes with him, I love him for his sake, and yet I know him a notorious liar. Think him a great way fool, solely a coward, yet these fixed evils sit so fit in him that they take place when virtue's steely bones look bleak i' the cold wind. Withal, full oft, we see cold wisdom waiting on superfluous folly. It's profound. Because in that moment, and if you paid attention to that, she sings this high praise of Bertram and her love for him. And yet she sees him also as the coward and the fool that he really is. And these fixed evils, as she describes, they can be dealt with because the cold wisdom that waits on superfluous folly is still there. And from the very beginning, this is the very first act, the first scene. When I read that, I knew that I was dealing with a very real character here, and she carries forward as truly the most dynamic in that story. So let's proceed forth to another one here. This next little snippet, I tie to the first one that I just read because it's going to give it a deeper side of Helena's understanding of the man that she loves. And so as I relayed the story to this, as we go forward into Act 3, in this particular scene 2, Helena has driven Bertram away because he's basically been forced into this marriage by the king, and he goes to the Italian wars to be rid of that bond. And Helena here in this particular little soliloquy carries on what I just read in a sense, and then there's this deferential release that comes as well. And again, another form of great dynamism in the language that to me was really endearing. And so I'm going to read this as well. And so the Countess and others that were around have now left, and she's standing by her side, lamenting the fact that Bertram's gone, and she realizes she's the source of his exile. She says, "Till I have no wife, I have nothing in France." And she's quoting Bertram, what he said before he left. And now this is her speaking to herself. "Nothing in France until he has no wife. Thou shalt have none, Roussillon, none in France. Then hast thou all again. Poor Lord, is it I that chase thee from thy country and expose those tender limbs of thine to the event of the none-sparing war? And is it I," turning the page here, "that drive thee from the sportive court, where thou wast shot at with fair eyes to be the mark of smoky muskets? O you leaden messengers that ride upon the violent speed of fire, fly with false aim, move the still peering air that sings with piercing. Do not touch my lord. Whosoever or whoever shoots at him, I set him there. Whoever charges on his forward breast, I am the caitiff, that do hold him to it, and though I kill him not, I am the cause his death was so effected. Better 'twere I met the raven lion when he roared with sharp constraint of hunger. Better 'twere that all the miseries which nature owes were mine at once. No, come thou home, Roussillon, whence honour but of danger wins a scar, as oft it loses all. I will be gone. My being here it is that holds thee hence. Shall I stay here to do it? No, no. Although the air of paradise did fan the house, and angels officed all, I will be gone, that pitiful rumour may report my flight, to consolate thine ear. Come night, and day, for with the dark poor thief I'll steal away. And with that, Helena departs France, and at that moment, as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, okay, she's done. She can just let this go. Of course, we're going to see what happens in the stories. I've already described this, was she already had another plan. So again, the interplay of language is so vital. We get another side of Helena. She sees the full picture, and yet she's still cunning enough to pursue the man that she sees flawed. He's acting like a petulant little bitch. I'm sorry, he is, and that's probably the best way to describe it. He was cajoled into a marriage, but his own way of handling the situation was pretty weak. He takes off, and she has the wherewithal to see this for what it is. She is able to check her passion, and yet she still follows it. And so again, this got me very curious, and there's a little bit of irony here, and I love what Shakespeare's doing, but through this character, Helena, there is a depth, and again, this humanness and this quality of womanhood that is so resounding and powerful, and reminds me of why when I read Shakespeare, I tend to gravitate more towards the women. I don't mean this because I'm a man and I'm interested in women, or in the woman. I love my wife. I don't mean it like that, but in the sense of this idea of what attracts a man to a woman and the interplay between a man and a woman. It's the woman that tends to be the most dynamic, the most endearing, and also the most strident in the language that comes out. And that is what is so profound in this language here. So I want to step back for just a moment, because in Act 2, I talked about the enforcement of this marriage arrangement as a result of the wager that Helena made with the king, which she delivers. He's feeling better. And the king is going to talk up the reasons why Bertram, not only is he going to marry Helena, but what the king can do to make the hesitancy that Bertram describes less of an issue. And so here's the interplay. And in the middle of this is Helena. And so it's Helena, it's Bertram, and the king at the palace in Paris. And Bertram is being, as I'd said, enforced by the king. Both of these men are fools. They just very out and out fools. And I know Shakespeare, I wasn't alive when he wrote it, but in reading this, I know that Shakespeare was really very clear in his intent here, because it's the way it comes across, at least in how I read it. But Helena's grace shines. It's more subtle, but it shines here. And her broad perspective not only heightens her attractiveness, but also paints to this dynamism in a relational aspect between a man and a woman and a man. And the greater aspect of what I would say here leads to this ebb and flow and this push and pull within the tension of a relationship that comes out. And I also like the interplay here. So it starts with Helena. She's speaking to Bertram in front of the king. She's actually speaking to the king here, but speaking to Bertram. She says, I dare not say I take you, but I give me and my service ever whilst I live into your guiding power. This is the man. She's pointing, as it were. It's not in the play, but this is how I see it, pointing to Bertram. And then the king responds, why then, young Bertram, take her. She's thy wife. Bertram responds, my wife, my liege, I shall beseech your highness, in such a business give me leave to use help of mine own eyes. And I put in the margin here, I wrote playboy, because obviously he's like, leave this to me, king. I can see with my own eyes what I'm interested in. And the king says, knowest thou not, Bertram, what she has done for me? And Bertram says, yes, my good lord, but never hope to know why I should marry her. And the king responds, thou knowest she has raised me from my sickly bed. Bertram, but follows it, my lord, to bring me down must answer for your raising? I know her well. She had her breeding at my father's charge, a poor physician's daughter, my wife. Disdain rather corrupt me ever. And then this is where the king, his ego kind of gets into this a little bit. He says, 'tis only title thou disdainedest in her, the which I can build up. Strange is it that our bloods of colour, weight, and heat, poured all together, would quite confound distinction, yet stand off in differences so mighty. If she be all that is virtuous, save what thou dislikest, a poor physician's daughter, thou dislikest a virtue for the name, but do not so from lowest place when virtuous things proceed. The place is dignified by the doer's deed. Where great addition swells and virtue none, it is a dropsied honour. Good alone is good without a name. Vileness is so. The property, by what it is, should go, not by the title. She is young, wise, fair. In these to nature she's immediate heir, and these breed honour. That is honour's scorn, which challenges itself as honour's born, and is not like the sire. Honours thrive when rather from our acts we them derive than our foregoers. The mere word's a slave, debauched on every tomb, on every grave, a lying trophy, and as oft is dumb where dust and damned oblivion is the tomb of honoured bones indeed. What should be said? If thou canst like this creature as a maid, I can create the rest. Virtue and she is her own dower, honour and wealth from me. And then here's Bertram, I cannot love her, nor will strive to do it. And the king responds, thou wrongest thyself if thou shouldst strive to choose. And here is Helena with this grace and understanding in the midst of these great egos that are being pounded out. That you are well restored, my lord, I am glad. Let the rest go. And Helena is willing to just let this go, or so we think. The irony is she isn't, because she's already designing in her mind, which we'll later find out how she's going to go about this. And the king responds to this graceful understanding that Helena offers. She says, my honour's at the stake, which to defeat I must produce my power. So here's the ego trip, as he's saying here. Here, take her hand, he's saying this to Bertram, proud, scornful boy, unworthy this good gift. That dust and vile misprision shackle up my love and her desert. Thou canst not dream, we, poising us in her defective scale, shall weigh thee to the beam. That wilt not know it is in us to plant thine honour where we please to have it grow. Check thy contempt, obey our will, which travails in thy good. Believe not thy disdain, but presently do thine own fortunes that obedient right, which doth thy duty owes and our power claims, or I will show thee from my care for ever into the staggers and the careless lapse of youth and ignorance, both my revenge and hate, loosing upon thee in the name of justice, without all terms of pity. Speak thine answer. And then Bertram concludes here, or speaks. He says, Pardon, my gracious lord, for I submit my fancy to your eyes. When I consider what great creation and what dole of honour flies where you bid it, I find that she, which late was in my nobler thoughts most base, is now the praised of the king, who so ennobled as were born so. And the king says, take her by the hand and tell her she is thine, to whom I promise a counterpoise, if not to thy estate a balance more replete. And Bertram responds, I take her hand. But you can tell he's just been backed into this corner, and the king concludes by saying, good fortune and the favor of the king smile upon this contract, whose ceremony shall seem expedient on the now born brief, and be performed tonight. The solemn feast shall more attend upon the coming space, expecting absent friends. As thou lovest her, thy love's to me religious, else does err. In reading that, I did have a slight sense of sympathy for Bertram, but only up to a point. The bottom line here is that the king was blind because he's acting out of wager speak, but his ego gets involved. And Bertram, who obviously has other designs and what he wants to do with his life, is forced into this corner and just reveals himself as the shallow guy that he is. Helena, right in the middle of that, with that language, is so soft, and yet she's very, very much overpowering to both of these men because she can see them both for who they are without having to say as much. And again, a great mechanism here and great writing by Shakespeare. I'm going to shift gears here. So I want to go to a small little part. There's only two more that I'm going to share, and then we're going to round this out with Kate Bush and why I pulled her back into this. So let's proceed forward now to two French lords that are in the Florentine camp. So this is in Act 4, much later in the play, towards the end, Scene 3. And this is a very beautiful offering of expression and ironic truth. These two French lords are amongst their soldiers. It's probably in the evening. And let me turn to that passage really quick here that was just really, really great. And I think it really underpins the beauty within this whole movement of the story. The Lord says to the other Lord, he says, the web of our life is of a mingled yarn, good and ill together. Our virtues would be proud if our faults whipped them not, and our crimes would despair if they were not cherished by our virtues. I think if I were to point to one particular piece of this play that probably, in my mind, Shakespeare is really driving at with this whole thing that all's well that ends well, is the weaving, the web of this mingled yarn. I thought about George Carlin again. It brought it back. The cadence, the oratory, the rhetoric, the storytelling, the laughter, having a punchline, the machinations and the frustrations of our lives, the things that come into our daily aspects that are either trivial or cataclysmic. All of these things interplaying with the small joys and the happinesses and the pursuits that we have ultimately lead us to where I think all of us hope that we're going to get. And then it goes back to, like I said at the beginning, with the title of this, Whate'er the Course, the end is the renown. And Shakespeare is setting this up, even though we can already kind of tell how this story is going to go, because there's really nothing hard to figure out with the story based on the bed trick and what Helen is going to do to get the man that she loves, even though he's really not worthy of her love. And it's fascinating to read that. So now we'll go to another quick scene in Act 5 and then one in Act 4 tied together here where Helena, so this is an enjoinder to what I just read. These are two very short little lines. Helena is speaking with Diana and the widow in Florence. Those lovely Italian women and Helen and the French woman, and they're having this dynamic conversation about, this scheme that they're putting together. And these are the words that they offer. The first is, let me just pull this up here really quick. I turn the page. She says to Diana, she says, and time revives us. All's well that ends well, still defines the crown. Whate'er the course, the end is the renown, from which I took the title. And then just a bit further, now in France, when they're making their way back to the palace, so she says this, so it's a repeat. Shakespeare's kind of giving us these little fine points, like weaving that yarn that he talked about with the Lord, or mingling the yarn. Helena says here, all's well that ends well yet, though time seems so adverse and means unfit. That somehow, in the space of where we're traveling to, and in the context of the story, that the acclamation and the high honor of the experience will make itself known in the end, and that whatever bitterness is striking itself upon itself or ourselves in that moment, that there might be something in that elevates the experience. And again, it might be wishful thinking, and I think we probably all do that from time to time. I know Shakespeare is certainly drawing on that insight, and we keep getting that from Helena. She's bringing that out. But it speaks to her acuity, her sense of self, and her sense of life, that there is a stratagem to living as well as a grace to living, and she seems to capture both and pull them in, and her reasoning and her logic in the words that she chooses demonstrates this great deal of emotional intelligence. And the concluding piece of this little play that I'm going to read right now is the very ending, where we have Bertram and LeFou and the king. LeFou is summarizing to Bertram some of what he's observed. There's a prematurity or a prematurely wise counsel from the king, and Bertram's, as he describes it, his dusted eye, which I'll read in just a moment. And then the generosity of Helena at the very end, and her words, which if you listen for, she'll say this. She describes Bertram as being wondrous kind, which is ironic because he never really truly was, and yet she describes him as that. So let me just read a few of those lines, and we'll end this portion of it. So Bertram is before the king. He's come back from the wars in Florence, and he's prepared to marry Diana, and he's explaining that, the marriage that I had before is forfeit. Helena's gone. And, I've met this woman and whatever. And you're going to hear the interplay of the king. And what's interesting, as I'd mentioned, the king is premature in his grace, but the king is willing to let bygones be bygones as he listens to the graciousness of Bertram, which is its folly and it's shallow, which we'll see as Diana and Helena and the widow show up shortly thereafter. So Bertram says this. He says, "My high repented blames, dear sovereign, pardon to me." And the king responds, "All is whole, not one word more of the consumed time. Let's take the instant by the forward top," which means to make the most of this present moment. "For we are old, and our quickest decrees the inaudible and noiseless foot of time steals ere we can effect them. You remember the daughter of this lord." "Admiringly, my liege. At first I stuck my choice upon her." This is Bertram now responding. "Ere my heart durst make too bold a herald of my tongue, where the impression of mine eye in fixing contempt his scornful perspective did lend me, which warped the line of every other favour, scorned a fair colour, or expressed it stolen, extended or contracted all proportions to a most hideous object. Thence it came that she whom all men praised, and whom myself since I have lost have loved, was in mine eye the dust that did offend it." So he's admitting here a little bit that, hey, I got my vision a little clouded, got a little hot and bothered, and in a way I can see Bertram trying his best, but Bertram also is going to get what he thinks he got, which he isn't going to get, and he's going to be surprised by that. And the king says, "Well excused, thou didst love her strikes some scores away from the great compt," meaning the account. So he's saying, okay, you expressed that you did have some love for her. We'll let some of these, the petulant behavior that you demonstrated go. I'm giving insight here. But he says, "But love that comes too late, like a remorseful pardon, slowly carried to the great sender, turns a sour offense, crying, 'That's good, that's gone.' Our rash faults make trivial price of serious things we have, not knowing them until we know their grave. Oft our displeasures to ourselves unjust destroy our friends, and after weep their dust. Our own love, waking cries to see what's done, while shameful hate sleeps out the afternoon. Be this sweet Helen's knell, and now forget her." So the king acknowledges this, and he says, all right, all's gone, all's well that ends well, kind of as he's saying here. We'll go ahead and forget her. Send forth your amorous token for the fair Magdalene, which is Diana, who the king thinks he's now going to meet. And the king says, "The main consents are had, and here we'll stay to see our widower's second marriage day." So we think, oh, this is all good. The king is, he's over it. The king's in for a surprise. So is Bertram, because now a gentleman steps forward into the palace, and he says, "Gracious sovereign, whether I have been to blame or no, I know not. Here's a petition from a Florentine, who hath for 4 or 5 removes come short to tender it herself. I undertook it, vanquished thereto by the fair grace and speech of the poor suppliant, who by this I know is here attending. Her business looks in her with an importing visage, and she told me in a sweet verbal brief it did concern your highness with herself." And here he hands the king a letter. The king reads, and I quote, "Upon his many protestations to marry me when his wife was dead," this is Diana, by the way, "I blush to say it, he won me. Now is the Count Roussillon a widower. His vows are forfeited to me, and my honours paid to him. He stole from Florence, taking no leave, and I follow him to his country for justice.
Grant it me, O king, in you it best lies, otherwise a seducer flourishes and a poor maid is undone. Diana Capulet. So LeFou steps forth. He's an old gentleman or an old lord here, an attendant of the king. He says, I will buy me a son-in-law and a fair and toll for this. I'll none of him. So it just really pisses him off because he's like, geez, Bertram's just deceitful. He's a shit to the end. And now the king's pissed because he's like, I just got done giving this guy a pass. We were going to celebrate the second marriage. And this is what the king says. He says, the heavens have thought well on thee, LeFou, to bring forth this discovery. Seek these suitors, go speedily and bring again the count. I am afeard the life of Helen lady was foully snatched. And the countess, the mother of Bertram, says, now justice on the doer. So they're all very, very upset with Bertram at this point. Bertram is probably just pooping in his pantaloons at this point. And this is how it concludes. So the final line here is Diana steps forth into the palace. And she says, but for this lord who hath abused me, and she's pointing to Bertram, as he knows himself, though yet he never harmed me, here I quit him. So she's breaking the engagement that he thought he had with Diana. He knows himself my bed he hath defiled, and at that time he got his wife with child. And here's the riddle. Dead though she be, she feels her young one kick. So there's my riddle. One that's dead is quick. And now behold the meaning. And as Shakespeare is so great in doing, this is kind of how he rounds it out. Enter the widow with Helena, and the king loses his mind. Is there no exorcist beguiles the true office of mine eyes? Is it real that I see? And Helena says, no, my good lord, 'tis but the shadow of a wife you see, the name and not the thing. And here's the line from Bertram that I talked about a bit earlier. He comes forth, and so quickly, in the matter of 4 words, he says, both, oh, pardon. And just like that, Shakespeare lets him off the hook, or so we think, or, it is in the play. And Helena, this is the grace that comes forward that some find is shallow on her part, but I actually saw is very magnanimous. She says, oh, my good lord, when I was like this maid, and she's pointing to Diana now, suggesting that when she was in the bed as Diana, I found you wondrous kind. There is your ring, and look you, here's your letter. This it says, from my finger you can get this ring, and are by me with child, etc. This is done. Will you be mine? Now you are doubly won. And Bertram accepts the bond, and they end up being happily married. And as it concludes at the very end here, I think it is the king. The king says, all yet seems well, and if it ends so meet, the bitter past, more welcome is the sweet. On the surface, in the language and the conclusion of the play, it's very easy, and I could immediately see this, to write the play off and to say, oh, this is just too trivial, or it's too clean. They just moved on. And to judge in that moment both Helena and Bertram. I was already judging Bertram very heavily anyway, because I never found any redeeming quality in him at all. Everything he does is out of convenience. With Helena, what I was amazed by was her persistence in the love and the generosity and the grace that she grants Bertram from the very beginning all the way to the very end, and ends up getting what she desires. And yet, and this is me now going beyond maybe what Shakespeare thought, I think that Helena in that moment realized where the power center really was. And then this is where I'm going to seg, because it got me thinking more in depth about a real relationship. This was kind of a cartoon relationship in a play. It was an interlude, but Shakespeare brings out a thought process in the language of Helena that is very easy to translate into the reality of the lives that we lead, and I think explains the beauty and the necessity of this play, All's Well That Ends Well, is that there is a fuzzy logic in our lives that in the relationships that we form and the ones that we pursue, that is natural. And it's actually a good thing because it brings us to those that we care about. But when we get to that iron cross of making the commitment, whether by stratagem or whatever, or by nature, it could be a myriad of situations. The relationships that count are the ones that are able to go the distance. And I definitely can see in Helena, she has that makeup. With Bertram, I don't think that's the case. And so what I took away from the play, All's Well That Ends Well, is that it really won't matter what comes after this moment. Helena is very grounded in exactly who she is, and she's capable. She's dynamic. She's very articulate, and she's very emotionally adept at understanding the life that she's leading and the control that she has and the things that she is aspiring to be. And so I thought that, and it's not just about control, by the way. That's a bad word because it sounds as if she's trying to control. She's not. She accepts the nuance and the murkiness and the messiness of life, but she has the wherewithal to still be generous in her spirit and in her outlook. And so, as I'd mentioned just a moment ago, and this is where I'm going to conclude tonight's production, I was thinking about Kate Bush in the song Running Up That Hill, in this focus of the relationship and the aspect of the Iron Cross at the moment of that commitment, what it takes to move forward in a relationship that matters. And to get to, as the title of this oratorical essay, Whate'er the course, the end is the renown. To get there requires a lot of work and a lot of steps. And I know I'm expanding here and I'm taking some liberty, but it's all conclusive back to the oratory and the rhetoric and what George Carlin talked about it, the humor in our lives as well as the disappointments. And the song Running Up That Hill, A Deal with God, was very insightful to me because I kept hearing that song in my head as I was reading Helena's language. And again, it might have been proximity because I've been listening to that a lot lately. I'm not trying to make anything impressionable to the point that, it called that up. But so often in life, and this is how I am as a writer and as a thinker, things that are in my mind that I'm pursuing, I may not fully understand the grasp of it, but they have a way of coming together at the right time. And this felt like one of those things. It was, as I described in a previous podcast, I talked about a ratatouille moment where I'm juxtaposing two things that didn't really seem to come together, and in this case, they did. Kate Bush's words, or Helena's words, made her far fuller than the page might have otherwise suggested in Shakespeare. And in listening to the track, Running Up That Hill, A Deal with God by Kate Bush, what I hear is the similar kind of perspective of a very insightful, powerful, strong, brilliant woman who is Kate Bush, singing about the dynamic and dire nature of a relationship that's meaningful to her. And the track, if you get a moment, take a listen to it. It's a classic track. It was a big hit when it came out in 1985. It's on the Hounds of Love album. And it's the title, or I believe it's the lead-off track at that album. I'm pretty sure that it is. I don't have it in front of me right now, but I seem to remember that was the first one. I had it on a cassette tape, and I've been listening to it on Spotify lately. But anyway, the track begins with that steady beat, and it's a dun 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 dun, and then in the backdrop, the synthesizer comes in, wah wah wah. Wah, 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 and then Kate Bush's urgency and pitch and bird-like lilt in this cutting sound of her voice comes in, and the beat is like running, like revving an engine. And so keeping that in mind, that dun 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 dun, wah, 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 and I'm not going to sing it. I did some singing in the previous one, but listen to the words on this right now. It doesn't hurt me. It doesn't hurt me. Do you want to feel how it feels? Do you want to know that it doesn't hurt me? Do you want to hear about the deal I'm making? It's you and me. And if I only could, I'd make a deal with God, and I'd get him to swap our places, be running up that road, be running up that hill, be running up that building. See if I only could. Oh, you don't want to hurt me, but see how deep the bullet lies. Unaware, I'm tearing you asunder. Ooh, there is thunder in our hearts. Is there so much hate for the ones we love? Tell me, we both matter, don't we? It's you and me. It's you and me, won't be unhappy. And if I only could, I'd make a deal with God, and I'd get him to swap our places. Be running up that road, be running up that hill, be running up that building. Say, if I only could, oh, it's you and me. It's you and me. Won't be happy. Oh, come on, baby. Oh, come on, darling. Let me steal this moment from you now. Oh, come on, angel. Come on, darling. Let's exchange the experience. Oh, And if I only could, I'd make a deal with God. And I'd get him to swap our places. I'd be running up that road, be running up that hill with no problems. Say, if I only could, I'd make a deal with God. And I'd get him to swap our places. I'd be running up that road, be running up that hill with no problems. And she goes on in this cadence and this beat. And again, what I was hearing in that, and again, juxtaposing this idea of Helena and this idea of what I was hearing, that the track carried something that was very telling about the language and the power in that language. The question I had, and as I was listening to the song again, is that if running up that hill leads to the destination that Kate Bush is singing about, she's singing about this relationship with the man she loves, or it doesn't matter, it could be a woman, but that person that she is entitled and wanting to be with, not entitled, that's probably the wrong word, but the person that she has bartered with and committed herself to, whether by stratagem or obviously earnest connection. And obviously this is a real relationship she's singing about, so I'm not trying to diminish that. But the thought was, and this is kind of that ironic twist in the wording, and as I was thinking about Shakespeare, is what if she gets to the top of that hill that she's running up to, making this deal with God to swap the experience that she has as a woman with the man that she loves, and he with her in a vice versa mirroring kind of aspect. But if they get to the top of that hill, and it isn't what they thought, that the whate'er the course, the end is the renown, is not renowned, is not something that's majestic or not something that's fulfilling, then is it the same as all's well that ends well, or is it all that isn't well that doesn't end well? And that's poorly stated, but the point of the matter is, and this is where it came full circle for me, is that I don't think that really matters. I think all's well that ends well implies the fact that life, there really isn't a whole lot that may or may not be well, but it will end well if the commitment and the focus and the grace of that interplay is real, and there's an interchange that goes on there. And I pulled up the video for the song. I hadn't seen it in a long, long time, and I'd actually completely forgotten until I started to watch the first few seconds of it. And I was about to turn it off because I was like, I don't know if I really want to watch the video because it's interpretive dance. And that says nothing about, I'm fine watching interpretive dance, but I wasn't in the mood to watch that. And then all of a sudden I was like, no, wait a minute. This is really great what Kate Bush is doing here. And she does this video. I pulled up the name of the dancer. His name was Michael. I think it's Hairview. He was a professional dancer, but the music video is a performative art in dance. There's no singing to the words, and MTV wasn't going to play it because they, at the time back in the day, they wanted songs where they were lip syncing along to the lyric. But Kate Bush was insistent on the fact that the lyric alone was enough to carry this because of the interplay between the man and the woman. And they're dressed in these lavender outfits, and there is a struggle going on. It's a movement, it's a dance, it's a climb, it's a run, it's a swim, it's a tussle. There's a pulling apart and a pulling away from each other into this hallway of masks. And she sings in the lyric of the song, let's exchange the experience. It's you and it's me. Come on, baby. Come on, darling. Take my hand. Anyway, she's singing about this in this very passionate way, and she's making this deal with God to just get her man to switch places with her so that he can see and feel what she sees and feel, and vice versa. And this is where Helena came back to me. I think this is where Bertram for me was redeemed, is that Helena is doing that for Bertram. It's the same thing that Kate Bush is singing about. She loves him so completely, even in his folly and in his gaps and in the trivialities of his own thinking, that she is able to portray upon him the experience that she has in this unmitigated, unrequited, and soon-to-be fulfilled love that she's going to give her all for, because she knows he's capable of not only understanding that, but when he gets a taste of that, when that experience, that exchange of experiences is rendered full, that in fact what Bertram says at the end, that he will fully love her, I think she actually believes that. And I think that Bertram is capable of that. I like to believe that for all of us in particular relationships, certainly in the ones that we commit our lives to. And it's very endearing. It's strong. It's powerful. And again, I realize that with all's well that ends well, I'm not trying to make this connection that that's what Shakespeare is trying to say, But with Kate Bush, I got an added insight. And again, it comes back to the wording and what she expresses in the passion of that. What she said, and this is a direct quote, Kate Bush says, "I was trying to say that really a man and a woman can't understand each other because we are a man and a woman. And if we could actually swap each other's roles, if we could actually be in each other's place for a while, I think we'd both be very surprised." And she's laughing as she says this, and she says, "I think it would lead to a greater understanding." And really the only way I could think it could be done was either, I thought a deal with the devil, and I thought, well, no, why not a deal with God? Because in a way, it's so much more powerful. The whole idea of asking God to make a deal with you. You see, for me, it is still called the deal with God. That was its title, but we were told that if we kept that title, it would not be played in the religious countries. Italy wouldn't play it. France wouldn't play it. Kind of interesting because all's well that ends well. And again, I'm pulling this in. She wasn't thinking that take place in Italy and France. And Australia wouldn't play it. Ireland wouldn't play it. And that generally we might get it blacked purely because it had God in the title. At the very end of the sequence, they show Kate Bush with this dancer, this Michael Herview. They're miming the drawing of an arrow in a bow. And I'm going to take it a step further, as if pulling an arrow, and actually they do the motion of taking the arrow first from the quiver in the back and bringing it forward into the bow. And the drawing of the arrow from the quiver of life into the bow of the woman, the bow of the man, the female archer making a deal with God to run up that hill. Whate'er the end is the renown, all's well that ends well. And that humanness, that womanhood, all of that came full circle. And for me, what really stands, and in reading Shakespeare, is I'm reminded that it doesn't matter what character I come across, when the language is right, when it's true to the human aspect of what's there for us to experience as we live our own lives, and then we pick up these little resonances along the way. It's very powerful in a reinforcement of the experience of what we take in this. I don't know what the end stage of my life will be, but I do believe that all's well will end well as long as I have the right focus in the relationships that I keep. My relationship with the people that I love, particularly with my wife, who I adore and I cherish, and I want to be the best husband I can be in how I portray what I'm doing, and the language that I seek, and how I serve my own humanity and the people that I'm going to meet along the way. These things come back, and it's something that I think as we all go out the door every day, if we can try to think about what we give. And we may have our own stratagems about how we think we're going to get where we're going to go. But I think in thinking about Helena, and then also like the song with Kate Bush, thinking about George Carlin's grandfather, the policeman, there is a joy in the expression of the things that are most common to us, the pains that are the most real, the joys that are most real, the things that we understand in ourselves and may not be able to express, but in the acts of what we do, I think that makes the most difference. So with that, I will draw to a conclusion, and I appreciate you being with me tonight. And just keep going, and remember that whatever the course, the end is the renown. Thank you for being with me here in these small hours.